Dezero was born in the city known as New Yorling, within the branch called Hutsman Borough, a heavily crime-invested branch of the city. It is also known to be the home of Akin, with little to magical background. New Yorling is known to be the very few places where magicka is under strict surveillance. Not even the Akin authorities use magic, despite it being using in enforcing the law. The high crime rate of the city is due to the lack of authoritative presence within some of the more urban areas due to the large number of citizens, dwarfing the actual authoritative figures of the city. This means that more crimes such as theft, mugging, public dispute and even murder can happen, and does happen on a daily basis. Amongst the other four branches, Hutsmen is the most dangerous, as it happens to be the birthplace of gang mentality with penchant for violence and drugs. The gangs that form there has gotten so bad that the police force has been up to their necks in trying to crack down on the violent activities. Dezero grew into the lifestyle of gangs. Being an only child to a mother, he'd often leave home alone to roam the streets. His father was never around nor part of his life, which put Dezero on the road to becoming a gangster. With his innate ability to bring others together and lead, it was no time at all before he would become the leader of his gang shortly after the death of its former leader. One day, one of Dezero's boys would come to him in aid after he was jumped by rival gang members. Dezero asked the boy of the whereabouts to the location of the rival members. Dezero may have just been 17 at the time, but he was ruthless and cared about his boys. Once he found the location of the rivals, Dezero, along with his group of 5 others, moved in for a counterattack. The location was at an abandoned warehouse. Dezero was not unfamiliar to abandoned places. However, he and his boys felt extremely uneasy about the warehouse. The outside was gloomy, especially at night, and the graffiti along the walls seemed to radiate something ominous. Despite the ill feeling, Dezero and his crew moved in. It was quiet and dark as they walked inside the warehouse. Through their uneasiness, Dezero could feel tension, as if he could feel their rivals were planning to ambush them in the darkness. Sure enough, as soon as the thought entered Dezero's mind and the warning voice to his boys to keep their eyes open, the rival gang members sprang. A fight broke out between Dezero's boys and their rivals. The two sides were equally matched, turning the fight into an outright brawl of fists and kicks. Even in total darkness, everyone seemed to know exactly who they were fighting against. The brawl only lasted several minutes before the lights of the warehouse at the back of the building came crashing on, bringing the group of boys to a halt. Suddenly, both sides scrambled in different directions upon the calling voice of police and the sight of their flashlights searching through the dark. Through the panic, Dezero attempted to get his boys out of the line of dangers. He would lead them all back to where they entered inside of the warehouse. Before he would allow the last members to escape, one of them would stop him, explaining that he had to also escape. Dezero tried to argue against this, but the boy brought up a good point, that being that Dezero was not allowed to get himself caught for, if he did, it would bring their whole gang down, having missing their best leader and all. Dezero reluctantly agreed, and would remain hidden inside of the warehouse, as the police would bait after the rest of his boys and the rival members. While that went down, Dezero found a hidden door that was kept away behind wooden cargo crates. He'd slip through the crates enough to crack the door and disappear behind it. He turned around after closing to find that there were stairs leading further down into total darkness. Dezero carefully stepped down the stairs, feeling his way until he could feel another door. This one was barred with wood so rotten and worn that using his mere strength was enough to pull and break them away. On the other side, he could see that the room was poorly lit by the ceiling candles above. The first thing he noticed was the glowing vats of green. He had no idea what was inside of the large vats, but he could see that there were rows of them by the numbers. Dezero looked around, confused and astonished. He walked over to one of the vats and sniffed at it. Even with his human noise, the aroma of the green stuff was strong enough to repel him backwards and force him to cover his mouth and nose. The smell was so bad that it lingered in his stomach and caused him to feel nauseous. Now more curious than confused, Dezero began to look around the space. He passed the various rows of toxins and came to a wooden office desk. There was a single torch sitting on the desk. There seemed to be a pile of parchments and documents sprawled across the desk. Something in particular caught Dezero's eyes as he'd scanned the desk. It was a map out of the entire city of New Yorleng. The bird's-eye view of the drawings was what caught Dezero's eye, as he found it rather impressive, enough to garner further inspection. However, the longer Dezero inspected the drawing, the more his curiosity turned into horror. The notes that were scribbled on there gave him reason to look over to the vats of the green toxins, then peer deeper into the notes, reading and rereading the over and over till all he could mutter was, "What the fuck?" The sound of the back door being pried open broke Dezero from his dazed horror. Quickly he'd act, hiding behind one of the large metal racks of empty shelves. He saw 2 policemen enter the large room, their flashlights waving back and forth within the room, searching for anyone that wasn't supposed to be there. He waited for them to be far enough from the door before he managed to give them the slip right out. He was just nearing the exit and almost home free when one police officer managed to sneak up on him and grab a hold of him. There was a struggle between the two before Dezero was finally subdued by the other police officers. He was handcuffed and taken into custody down at the Department of Downtown Hunt, where he was then booked and charged for not only trespassing, but gang-related activity as well. "Dezero, do you know why you were arrested?" One of the interrogating officers asked, eyeing Dezero as he leaned on the desk Dezero was handcuffed to. Dezero, who had never been arrested in his entire life of being a gangster, was already familiar with how the police worked, so he was keen to their habits of trapping people into confessing their crimes and guilts. Calmer and coolly, he'd proceed. "Is it because I'm pretty?" The officer gave a little huff through his nose and stood up from leaning. "You were caught trespassing on private property." Dezero looked to the side at nothing in particular and shrugged. The place looked abandoned. How was I supposed to know it was private property? "Didn't you see the signs?" Another officer asked. Dezero looked at him in return and squinted his eyes, remembering the odd markings scrawled on the building, then tilted his head to the side. "I saw signs, but nothing that said 'keep out,' so I went in." "Alone?" Dezero blinked his squinted eyes and jumped his shoulders as if the officer had asked something stupid of him. "Yeah? Was I supposed to be with someone else?" The initial officer rounded his partner to stand beside him before he went on. "We know you weren't alone, and we know why you were there." Dezero sat back in his chair, his blue scruffed chin raised. "Oh, ye? So you come tell me? You know everything about me then? I've never been arrested." "Actually, we do," the second officer said before he would slam a folder in front of Dezero, who just now noticed that the officer was holding it beforehand. Dezero looked down at the presented folder, then back to the dark-skinned officer, who looked at him smugly. Dezero, who was still handcuffed, leaned his whole seated body to the side to look at its contents inside, with all the seriousness of a gangster leader. "Here, let me get that for you," the pale-skinned dogman officer said, opening the folder for a better look. Dezero took his time to glance over the information. Apparently, they did have him booked into their records. They even had his home location booked. Without much emotion in his voice, Dezero sat back in his chair and looked at the officer in the eyes. "You got everything on me except when I like to take a shit." The dark-skinned dogman officer suddenly slammed his fist on the desk, causing Dezero to click his eyes to him. "This shit isn't a game, Dezero Hernendez!" "You sound like my mother. Do you have pictures of when I was a baby in here?" Dezero continued, looking through the notes on him. "Play dumb all you want, Dezero. We know exactly who and what you are. Seems you and your gang boys have been having a good time at the expense of the innocents. With the leader caught and in custody, we can finally put this mess that you and your foul kind have created in this God's-forsaken city to rest." "You make it sound like you actually care," Dezero retorted, staring into the light-skinned officer. The officer smiled in triumph and leaned on the desk to sneer in Dezero's face. "Oh, you're going down, Dezero. You and your scummy kind will no longer run this city. It belonged to me now." Dezero gave the officer a long, hard look, then down at the folder of info on him. He didn't believe that one of his own members would betray him in giving out his identity, so he reckoned that one of the rival gang members who had been caught squealed on him, probably in an attempt to save his own life, considering how much was written about him in such a short time. With the amounting evidence against him, Dezero had no choice but to end the little game of charades. He sighed and relaxed in his chair, staring dully at the two officers. So what happens next? You're going to be held in a cell where you will await for the date of your court sentence. But we already know where you're headed, son. Dezero didn't like the sounds of that. He would play off his disappointment to not only himself, but to his boys as well. He sighed in exasperation as he leaned forward. That's too bad. I was looking forward to seeing Caramel in a couple of days. That's all right. She can come visit you while you're in jail, the light-skinned officer simply said as he helped his partner hoist Dezero up to his feet. As Dezero was pulled up, he steeled himself, staring into the officer that quipped at him. He may have been disrespectful towards them, but the cocky behavior of the light-skinned officer was getting to Dezero's patience. Soon as Dezero stood up, he delivered the nasty officer a sudden headbutt, smashing the officer in the nose and causing him to stumble back, holding his nose in pain. The dark-skinned officer quickly reacted. He rushed at Dezero and forced his forearm down on the gangster's neck, pushing him into the doorframe and securing him there. The forceful push bruised Dezero's face in the process. A scuffle between Dezero and the officers broke out of the office until he was bum-rushed by multiple officers who then proceeded to rush him to his cell. Dezero was put inside of a small cell with only himself to keep company. The front view of his cell, behind the bars, showcased the many other cellmates who paced back and forth within their tiny confinement or lain on their cot, filled with sorrow and regret. Dezero had the time to think to himself, seeing as he was being put away for life, possibly. His thoughts wandered to his mother first and foremost. He may have been disappointed in himself, in letting his boys down, but it was his mother he felt the most for. She was often left by herself while he ran the streets, but he never considered that she may have felt worry and lonely without him there. The money that he often brought to her along with a lavish house could not replace her son, and it took his incarceration for him to see that. Dezero pressed his head back against the wall and silently sobbed. "I'm sorry, Ma," he quietly said to himself and closed his eyes to allow the coming demons of his doings to carry him away. Death, as it were, came to him sooner than expected. While he sat on the ground, wallowing in his own guilt, something nauseous crept to his nose. The familiar scent of it was what woke Dezero in alert. It was the same toxic smell he encountered back at the warehouse, where those strange vats of green liquid were hidden. Dezero hastily scrambled to his feet and looked for the source of the smell. There in the left corner of the cement wall was a small hole where a tiny portion of the stone had fallen away, and there he could see the visible green toxin in gas form seeping through. He wasn't sure what was happening, but Dezero knew that he had to call for help. He ran up to the bars and tried to flag down the guards. It was late in the day, going by the lack of sunlight through the hole, so there wouldn't be many guards on duty. He had to try anyhow. While he was trying to flag down help, a realization rushed to him in a flash, and he was reminded exactly what the toxins were. With widen eyes, Dezero cursed loudly and braced himself, turning to face the wall, and threw up his hands. He had no idea why he did this, but not a second was spent before he'd see a glint of light from the corner where the hole was. Then his vision went white as a flash of light blinded him momentarily. There was an explosion, followed by the flash of light. Dezero was thrown back by the sheer force of the explosion, hitting the metal bars and dropping to the floor. It took Dezero struggling minutes to recover from the blast. He coughed out smoke that burned his lungs and eyes and slowly stumbled to a stand. His ears were ringing and head throbbing. He looked down at himself, out of breath and dazed. He saw blood on him, but wasn't sure where it was coming from. Dezero took a look around the room and tried to see through the haze of smoke. He could make out the wall, which had been miraculously left unscathed by the explosion. He then looked to the door, which had been blown off its hinges. The metal bars remained standing and undamaged. Still dazed, Dezero staggered his way to the blown opening of his cell. Coughing and hacking, he pushed through the cloud of smoke into utter chaos. The ringing in his ears grew louder as he stepped out, almost being ran over by an inmate who madly dashed down the corridor. The ringing in his ears were the sounds of fire alarms, the bells loudly ringing over the mayhem of voices, as both inmates and officers tried to make sense of whatever was going on. Dezero slowly walked towards the end of the corridor, where he could see raging fire reaching out from one of the cells. The fire was so large that the officers couldn't put it out. Dezero found himself drawn to the fiery scene and kept his slow pace towards it, like almost in a trance. Not even halfway down the hall, he was hit with another explosion from his right. The sudden impact pushed him some meters to the left. 4 more cells down, another cell was hit with another blast. Dezero gathered himself and ran to the first cell that was smouldering in smoke and fire. He called out for signs of life inside. Desperate to reach he shook the metal bars and stuck his hand through with his arm, attempting to help the trapped inmate he could see. When he called out to the fallen inmate, there was no answer. Dezero waited a few seconds longer for the smoke to dissipate wide enough or him to see through. He called out again with no response from the prone inmate. Even with their back turned to him, he could still recognize the clothing of the fallen inmate and was instantly stricken with grief. With his hand to his mouth, Dezero backed from the cell bars but would not settle in his shock as his mind raced to the other blown cells. Moving his feet in motion, Dezero dashed to see if he could save others. Before he would reach the damaged cells, he already knew who else would be in them. His knees weakened when his eyes caught up with what his heart already knew. He banged a defeated fist against the bars that once held his treasured members of his gang. Allowing his knees a moment to fall, he'd gather himself once more and searched for the nearest exit at the end of the corridor. The police had their hands full, dealing with the fires and inmates trying to get free for them to notice Dezero slipping out. He managed to sneak past the frantic guards and policemen all the way to the exit leading to the outside. He made it all the way out of the precinct and all the day down the road where he vanished from sight within the woods.